Dancing in the rain, let the sunshine in. Good morning, good afternoon, dear participants, to this very first thematic session of our 3 days, learning days and annual event. It's a great pleasure to have you here, so many participants from all over the world, and I still see more people dropping in. But we have a very packed program, so we really try to start on time and also to end on time. Wherever you are in the world now, whatever news you read, watch or listen to around the world, we have currently or recently floods that have never happened before, as in Brazil, as in the Gulf states, in East Africa or in Germany. On the other hand, we have also heat waves like in India or in Southeast Asia. And 2024 is the hottest year ever measured. We have to act. We have to act in many ways. We need urgently climate action and emission reduction, and we need also adaptation and disaster risk reduction. These are at the topics that are at the core of the work of the Swiss NGO DRR platform, and I would like to introduce you briefly this platform, which is the organizer and the host of this event. The platform is a network of Swiss-based non-profit, non-governmental organizations. It was founded in 2011, starting with 7 member organizations and steadily increased now up to almost 20. We work on shaping the understanding of disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation and enhance the quality of the project among us, the member organizations, always with the goal to strengthen the resilience of people, communities, and governments through disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. We work on 3 pillars: capacity building through learning and exchange, like this learning days we are in now, but also providing us mutually conceptual support and doing advocacy and policy dialogue. During the past almost 13 years, we steadily increased our partnerships and alliances. We collaborate closely with the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation. We work with several universities. We are member of the global network of civil society organizations on disaster reduction and member of PEDR, the Partnership for Environment and Disaster Risk Reduction. So we are more and more also connected at the international level through these networks and also through the networks of our members. And so we are proud to be part of this global community and really happy to have here today and for the next days more than 200 participants from all over the world that registered for our event. Today's session, Unpacking Weather, Water, Climate Services, Understanding the Fundamentals. You will hear speaking Johanna Zwalen from Soy Environment Network. Then you will hear Omar Belprat, climatologist and expert consultant, who was a very valuable backstopper for us through the whole learning journey. And myself, I'm Christina, I'm working at Helvetas. Just before we go into today's session, an overview of these learning days of these learning days and the annual event of these 3 days. When you registered, you have probably seen it, but just quickly what you can expect the next days. We start today with this introductory session, which will also run in the afternoon in Spanish. And then we go through different thematic aspects of weather, water, climate services that we found relevant, important for NGO practitioners to know when working, engaging in weather, water, climate services. We will start with early warning systems, anticipatory action. We will look at the platform experience that we capitalized in the last 2 years of our learning journey. We will have a deep dive into agrometeorological information services. We will hear about what evidence and research and evaluations tell us about the relevance and the impact of weather, water, climate services for disaster risk reduction and climate adaptation. We will have an overview from global to national about cooperation and frameworks. and we will learn about climate projections and local climate scenarios to end up with the last thematic session on Friday about private sector engagement. What is the potential? What are the challenges? And then on Friday afternoon, we have the concluding annual event. This event will be in a hybrid format, on-site in Bern and online, of course, for all our guests from all over the world. We will have then that Friday afternoon a short recap from all the sessions and then a panel discussion with very distinguished expert guests from different sectors, as you can see, from private, from public, from NGOs, from national and global entities. And all together, we will not only look back on this learning journey and what the findings were, but with these experts, we want to have a look into the future. What are the trends? What are the perspectives to reach access for all and especially for the most vulnerable through these weather, water, climate services? But now to this session today, this morning, the next 90 or 85 minutes. These are our objectives, very simple. We would like to get you familiar with the fundamentals of weather, water, climate services. How does it work and what do you need to know about these services as NGO practitioner to engage into that important work? So the agenda points will be introduction to that topic, introduction to basics and fundamentals. Then we will talk about what is or what could or what should be the role of NGO. And at the very end, we will have some time for discussion, for questions and answers. Some last information before we start. This is for this online session as for all the other online sessions. We would be very happy if you mute yourself unless you are speaking. If you can, turn your camera on if the bandwidth allows it, because it's nice to see who is here. Please rename yourself with the 3 dots up right in your picture. Show your name and your organization. This also helps us to see who is here with us. Then anytime you can add your questions in the chat and we will come back to it. Maybe sometimes we have to summarize if there are too many questions, but we will certainly take care of that. We have chat managers with us. And then we will have these spaces for discussion. Then please raise your hand if you would like to say something. All the sessions are translated. Down on your screen, go to the icon interpretation in the toolbar and choose your language. We will have in this session here French, and in other sessions we will have French and Spanish too. And as you have already seen with the registration, all the sessions will be recorded and this will be made available on our video channel. The link you will see on the website, drrplatform.org. With this, I would now like to hand over to my colleague, Johanna, and she will introduce you to the content of this session. The floor is yours, Johanna.
Thank you, Christina, and a warm welcome to this session also from my side. So before we dive into the basics of weather, water, climate services with Omar, I would like to provide a brief introduction to why we use weather, water, climate services and how they benefit us. Additionally, I would also like to shortly explain their importance for the Swiss NGO DRR platform. So I'm trying to change the slide. So why do weather, water, climate services matter? And I will explain why by addressing some of the pressing questions professionals all around the world, maybe including you participants, may have. Weather, water, climate services provide essential information about past, present, and future hydrometeorological and climate conditions. And this information is crucial for understanding and mitigating the impacts on our environment, agriculture, industry, and society. And with this, weather, water, climate services are indispensable in diverse decision-making processes. So they help professionals to make informed choices that enhance resilience and sustainability. For example, a health professional may need to determine the optimal timing for a meningitis vaccination campaign in her region. And climate forecasts can provide the data necessary to support her decision. For the slides are not moving. If someone could help me to just click to the next. Speech bubble. So that we can see what the farmer is asking. Somehow, yeah, exactly. So what I would like to explain here now shortly that similarly to a health professional, also a farmer may need to decide whether to plant drought-resistant seeds for the upcoming season. And also here, climate forecasts, future temperature and precipitation scenarios can guide this farmer or farmer all around the world in his agriculture and land use practices. Now, when we come to the engineer, an engineer may be tasked for developing energy systems. He may need to estimate the potential solar energy available in a particular area. And here, accurate climate forecasts will help her to design efficient and reliable systems. Moving on to a next professional, in the face of forecasted heavy rains, a community leader, firefighter, or someone responsible to respond to emergency may need to decide whether to evacuate a city. So timely meteorological and hydrological information here will be crucial for him or her to make life-saving decisions. And then a last example, a spatial planner or community leader may also rely on weather, water, climate services when assessing the options for village development. And here, historical data projections may inform him or her in planning the village in order to avoid additional risks and promote sustainable development. So in summary, and we can move on to the next slide, weather, water, climate services are not just about weather observations. They really provide the critical information needed to make informed decisions that protect lives, sustain livelihoods, and promote sustainable development. So they are essential for, in summary, early warning systems, as well as risk-informed and climate-smart planning, financing, and implementing of all kinds of projects, and in all kinds of sectors. So this applies to agriculture, public health, tourism, energy, water management, construction, urban planning, and more. For the Swiss NGO DRR platform, weather, water, climate services are particularly important. So as just summarized during the previous slides, weather, water, climate services play a crucial role in climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction. However, as many of us may know, assessing accurate and reliable information through weather, water, climate services can be very, very, very challenging for people in remote, neglected, and vulnerable areas. Service providers often do not consider these populations a priority, or hydrometeorological services may lack the capacity or resources to cover the entire territory. An additional challenge is that available information may not be translated into user-friendly language at local level. And here, NGOs and civil society organizations often step into this gap to address it. So NGOs often work to connect national level services with local communities and stakeholders who may otherwise struggle to get these very, very important services. Hydrometeorological services may also face difficulties in fulfilling the minimal standards. There are missing observational networks, poor data management, and absence of institutional mindset for service delivery are common issues. So NGOs and civil society organizations can assist beyond the intermediary role by supporting local organizations and institutions with required logistics, and often also with development of demanded services. Now, independent of the approach adopted by an NGO or a civil society organization, we from the platform think that it's essential for NGOs to have a comprehensive understanding of weather, water, climate services. This includes understanding the value cycle, the users, the providers, all key stakeholders involved, and their potential role. And we also realized that member organizations of the DRR platform and their partners that provide and use and assess weather, water, climate services are constantly learning to improve weather, water, climate services. And for this reason, weather, water, climate services have been identified as a key topic for the Swiss NGO DRR platform. And since 2020, a dedicated working group has been guiding this journey to enhance and improve the practices in weather, water, climate services. And here on this slide here, you have a short summary of what we have achieved so far. So 5 case studies have been developed based on common terms of references. These case studies have been presented and discussed in 3 rounds, each accompanied by external experts. The 5 experiences come from diverse contexts, including Mali, Madagascar, Tajikistan, Nicaragua, and Guatemala, and cover a range of scopes from national early warning systems to local agrometeorological forecasts. And despite the very various contexts, some common findings and lessons learned have emerged. And this is actually why, or one of the reasons also why we are here today. Those 5 key studies have guided the planning of the learning days. We are starting today, and also the platform's annual event on Friday afternoon this week. So as I just said, the studies were analyzed in an expert workshop. This facilitated feedback and critical discussions among members of the DRR platform and members presenting the case studies, as well as experts. This process led to a FAQ document, as well as a draft publication. This publication will be published very soon. And with this summary, regarding the learning journey and the short introduction about why weather, water, climate services matter, I would like to hand over to Omar so that he can continue with the basics.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome also from my side. It's a pleasure to give you some fundamentals of weather, water, and climate services, and based on the introduction we received now from Johanna. And I will try to give you a brief overview of this topic targeted to your area of engagement, so the area of NGOs in particular, and what essential questions are there that you have to deal with it. But let me start by giving you first a definition what these actually are, just in good academic tradition, but we have also that we have a common understanding of what we mean by weather and weather climate services. So I've chosen here the sentence of a quantitative information chain on weather, water, and climate, tailored for specific end users. And there are three elements I would like to point out here that are essential to this topic. So first of all, this quantitative information points towards that these are data-driven process. So it's really about quantifying a certain measure. So it's not a qualitative assessment, but there's a real technical element behind it, as you will be well aware, that is essential to this topic. Then it's about an information chain. So the information is given from one stakeholder to another. And so it is by nature a multi-stakeholder environment. And lastly, these are information services for specific end users, as has been shown by Johanna. So I want to point out here that data alone is not a service. So the data has to be processed to a specific end user, and hence there has to be an engagement with this end user and an understanding of the decision-making process so that this data really adds value. So before entering into our modern abilities, I would like to give you first an historical perspective where this comes from, because predicting weather has been a topic, as you imagine, that ranges back actually millennia in our history. And some of the first, sorry, the slides are moving by itself somehow. I have to go back.
Can I just make one remark from the interpretation services? To not move the slides so fast. If you could just go back to the previous one, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, somehow the slides are changing without having clicked. Well, again, so I wanted to give you just a brief overview where this field comes from. And as you imagine, weather forecasting has been a topic that has kept humanity busy for centuries, actually millennia. We have a first record, for instance, from Aristotle that tried to give some principles on how to predict the weather based on observations, for instance, of winds and so on. It turned out that most of his ideas were actually wrong, but it's not to blame him. It's because he also didn't have a mean to measure the atmosphere. So really, weather understanding became possible when first instruments became available, for instance, with the measuring atmospheric pressure by Torricelli in the 17th century. And then, of course, a high leapfrog took place when we were, for the first time, able to use computers to calculate our understanding of the physics of weather, and thereby provide the first weather forecasts using this physics. So this happened in the last century, and this was the beginning of a new era of weather and climate services that has led us what we have today. So as you will be aware, we have today a complete different system, what we call the global observing system, with many devices that are measuring the atmosphere, the oceans, the whole hydrological system. I picked up here a few examples. Today, there are about 1,800 weather balloons launched on a daily basis. So these are balloons that go up into the air and measure the vertical profile of the atmosphere. There are more than 300 satellites measuring the Earth and different parameters of it that are relevant for this field, of course, and more than 17,000 ground meteorological stations that are measuring the weather on the ground. So this seems like an awful lot, but actually there's a lot of gaps actually that we observe. So there's many details we are not able yet to measure and that play a crucial role. This is because this is a very interconnected system and all elements impact the other ones. And one of the largest gaps is actually the measurement on the ground in the global south, as many of you will be aware. Since the 80s, actually, ground stations have been declining. And we will hear more about in the session of the global frameworks, how, for instance, the WMO is promoting programs to fill this gap in the years to come. Another field which has changed dramatically, of course, also relating to this computer you saw in the previous slide, is the ability to predict weather and climate. This is because of this global observing system that provides us much more information, but of course also the advances in computing and supercomputing of such models. What you see here on this animation is actually while it looks like an image of the real atmosphere and how the winds transport different elements through it, it is not a recording, but it's really a simulation from a computer model. So from this perspective, you would not be able to distinguish reality from this simulation. And actually today we are speaking of creating a digital twin of the Earth because the resolution has improved very much in representing the Earth with a computer. And some of you might have heard that also artificial intelligence is moving the field very strongly forward, and we provide also many opportunities for countries in the global south to provide such high resolution forecast information. Not only in terms of spatial detail, but also in time, we have now many new opportunities that you might have heard of. I've now spoken mainly about the weather forecasting area. So this one on this right graph in the middle, when we speak about today and the next 15 days. So this product that most of you probably use on a regular basis. We have also actually products, what we call nowcasting. So these are anticipation of the next hours using observations, for instance, radar images. And this is essential, for instance, to anticipate a thunderstorm that is going to bring a lot of rain and therefore flooding. So very useful for disaster management. And we have also products that go beyond the scales of weather. So we call climate forecasts. These are monthly, seasonal, or even forecasts for the next years. This is possible, for instance, thanks to the phenomena of the El Niño Southern Oscillation. And I imagine many of you also use some of these. And in particular, this gave rise for different stakeholders to use this information in their decision-making. For instance, agricultural practices, as we will hear more about tomorrow, for instance. And then lastly, what has been also very prominent in the last decades is the projections of climate. We no longer speak here of forecasts because we know the climate depends very strongly on how humans will manage greenhouse gases. So we can only devise scenarios on how the climate will evolve and therefore use a different term called projections. But ultimately, we see this now as a seamless perspective from nowcasting to climate projections, which are using very similar models, and we are trying to connect this more and more. Generally, however, you see the uncertainty increases as you go to the right. So as you look more into the future, we have the highest accuracy with nowcast and weather forecasts. And as we go to longer time scale, it becomes a real challenge. And on Friday morning, we will hear more about, for instance, how to deal with this uncertainty when using climate projections for long-term adaptation to climate change, and so long-term measures as disaster mitigation measures. As I mentioned before, the quality of the forecasts have improved very much so. And in particular, when we look at weather forecasting, there has been a very strong increase since the 80s. You see in the right-hand figure an image from the European Center of Medium-Range Weather Forecasting. So it's a center which is currently providing the best weather forecasts worldwide. And you see how the forecast has improved since the 80s, where, for instance, a 7-day forecast is almost as good as a 3-day forecast was in the 80s. The issue is actually not that the forecasts are not good enough yet. So we are really good for many elements, but that these forecasts are not correctly used yet in many of the sectors that Johanna has introduced. And in particular in the Global South, these countries continue to profit little from it because this information chain is not closed. But there are, of course, efforts on how to advance this. And one of it is, for instance, the humanitarian sector that is using weather forecasts for anticipatory action. We will hear about this session, more about this, and how we can use good forecasts, for instance, for flood events, so that we can trigger humanitarian aid before an event hit the region. And there's been large success thanks to these new possibilities. So with that, I would like to launch a poll first before entering to the second part on how to improve WWCS. And would like to ask you first, what kind of channels do you use to get your weather forecasts at the personal level? Let's see a bit what comes up here. Let's wait a bit more. We have a lot on app on the phone, so we can see the mobile penetration has been very strong in the last decades, where TV and radio were stronger still in, let's say, 20 years ago, but they remain important sources, as you can see. So now we have almost everyone. And what I find also interesting to see is actually most have reported they just use the app that is on the phone. So these are ready-made, ready-installed applications from the providers of the phone company, so the telecom companies also. But you see, newspaper actually has become irrelevant, at least for this group of participants. Then we can perhaps go to the next question. So now you should see the results. And then, Antonio, we can perhaps go to the next question. What kind of forecast of those I've spoken of do you use for your work? So in your projects or your general roles? So here, the weather forecasts seem to dominate, but there's actually quite a large fraction also of users of seasonal forecasts and climate projections, which is which is interesting. Nobody has so far clicked on Nowcast. This is a product indeed used a lot by engineering companies or civil defense agencies. And also Nowcast are actually not available in many countries yet, particularly in the Global South. So most of you have answered, so I will close here the poll and show you the results. So weather forecast is important, or the most important service that seems to be used, but of course with climate change and the adaptation to climate change, many of you are using climate projections, and we will speak more about this now in the next part of the talk. So we can stop here, perhaps sharing, and get back to the slides. So the question I want to bring up here now in the second part of the talk is how to improve weather and climate services in the projects you are working on. So we should go one slide back again. And to do this, I'm going to introduce here what we call the value cycle, which is a concept promoted by the WMO, so the World Meteorological Organization, which shows how from the user, the data is generated and then processed back to a service, back to the user. And it's a concept that also many of the national hydrometeorological services organize themselves structurally along this, because it has the logical sense of this chain I mentioned in the beginning. And so this concept is useful also for NGOs, we think, to understand the context you are working on, to analyze where are actually bottlenecks in this system and what could be entry points for you. So where are elements where you think you can add value and where most work is perhaps needed also. So we'll go now through these elements and raise a few questions that are relevant for you and hopefully help you to guide the design or thinking on weather, water, and climate services in your context. So your starting point should be the user requirement. As I mentioned in the beginning, it's about improving decisions of users, and each user has a different decision-making process. So it's about a dialogue, understanding where does the user lack information, where are bottlenecks. Perhaps she or he doesn't know even what possibilities exist, so it's also about bringing in knowledge of the possibilities, or also about whether a service actually already exists, be on the national or international level, but that just is not reaching this user, or he's not fully understanding it. So this dialogue is about understanding what the service should be in the end, but also it's about creating trust and ownership. So action is only taken if the user trusts the information that he's receiving. So this is very central. And this ownership can even lead to taking an active role, as for instance, measuring data on a citizen basis, something that some of the projects will also show today in the afternoon. Then, of course, in many contexts, as I mentioned, in the Global South, lack of information is a key issue. And I would like to challenge always that whether it's really necessary to get new data, because this brings a lot of follow-up questions that are challenging to answer. But should you be convinced of that this is truly necessary, then it's important to think about, first of all, what kind of observations are needed that really improve the decisions of the users. Where do you need, at which location do you need this, and which accuracy? So it's a question also about, is perhaps a simpler device like a rain gauge you see in the image already good enough, or do you need more automatic stations that measure a whole set of parameters? This is because also, for instance, automatic stations, they are much more complex to maintain, And so you have to think about who is going to run this on the long term after the project has finished and under which custody. Many of the hydromet development projects have actually not been able to maintain this infrastructure and have failed to give continuity to this value process. So this is a critical step. Then when gathering information, of course, this has to be transmitted, be it on paper, but ultimately today, it will have to be digitized in order to process it and also be able to reach scale of many users. So this means management of data and also very important quality checks of it. Since ultimately your service quality will depend on the quality also of the information you are using. So this involves some basic know-how on ITC that is required in the project's expertise. And there are also other elements here that are important to mention. For instance, the legal constraints. Some of the countries actually are very restrictive, do not allow third parties to get information. And then also the question how you can share this information, whether you can share this on inside the country or internationally. Generally, if you're able to share the data, this is a great asset. So this is also a door opener for partnerships, for national agencies or international actors, and where you can team up in improving the system in your context with others. Then with, as I mentioned, with the observations, what we can generate, of course, forecasts. And this is an area which becomes then much more complex and requires specific expertise. Actually, most agencies in the Global South, also the national agencies, use global products to provide their forecasts because it has this complexity. But there are, of course, increasingly possibilities how to combine this global forecast with observations on the ground that the project, for instance, is devising. And there are, of course, also private companies that deliver ready-made solutions on having stations with forecasts. Some of you might be aware of it. Here, it's always a bit the question also on the service fee. Some of the global forecasts are for free. And then when private actors come into play, there's usually a fee again. And here again, the topic of sustainability is central. Then when the data is there, it has to be still brought into a service. So into an information that is understood by the user you want to you engage with. So for instance, the one we are very, we look at it very regularly are these weather icons. So how much rain is actually going to fall, for instance, in the next days. So this has a lot to do about the communication, and this is also an area where NGOs will have a lot of expertise in communicating to the beneficiaries. And it's also an opportunity to think about other stakeholders that might be interested in the service and that might even pay for these services, and thereby also add to a sustainable model of this value chain that, of course, is creating some costs. Once the services are there, we need to bring it to the user. We had just made a quick poll before. Of course, the mobile penetration has changed this element very strongly and increased a lot the ability to reach many people. But there's still many communities, as you'll be well aware, which are not part of this, are not included yet in this development. And so radio and television remain important sources, as we saw also in the poll. So particularly also in this event, we are concerned about reaching the most vulnerable population and the information for all, as we will discuss on Friday afternoon. At the same time, we should also think about how we can reach paying clients, of course. And finally, as it is also with these circles, we want to close the circle and learn from it and conduct learnings, user feedbacks on how well the services have worked from their perspective and to continue improving. This is something, for instance, that Swiss, the National Weather Service, is doing on a regular basis, asking the population how well the warning have been perceived, or the weather services, and this gives then information again on where to put in stations, where to look for quality improvements or better forecasts, and so on. So it's a critical element to keep improving. And improving also, of course, with many stakeholders. So this is the last slide I want to show, and relates to the definition I used to say in the beginning, that weather, water, and climate services is a multi-stakeholder environment, as you saw also in these different elements of the value cycle. So it's something we have to embrace. There are, as you know, the national hydromet services that play a crucial role in all of the countries. Some of it might be stronger, some are the weaker. Then there are the multilaterals and international actors in the center, the WMO, that provides standards, but also many opportunities from financing mechanisms to improve these services on a global scale and on the national scale. There are other national actors, for instance, civil defense or agriculture ministries, that are central in this dissemination process. The private actors are important. We speak more about these also on Friday morning. Telecom companies or media companies. The academic partners, of course, central when developing services, and these are probably partners you are more used to work with. And finally, of course, the communities and the smallholders, which you want to address and reach and put the focus on. So with that, I like to give back the word to you, Christina, and happy to take then also questions then in the later part of today's session.
Thank you very much, Omar. I am waiting to have again my control on my screen. Thanks a lot. Yeah, thanks, Omar, for this overview. I think there are like two things we should remind. On one hand, this value cycle with these different steps, which are really crucially important if we as NGOs want to support that weather, water, climate services. And the second message on your very last slide, Omar, it is a complex, multi-stakeholder environment, and we have to have that clear if we want to engage as NGO in that area. I can't move my slides. Now it works, yeah. So just a brief outlook on what the role of NGOs in strengthening weather, water, climate services is or could be. And I would like to start with a poll about you, where you come from, and what your experience is. I would like you to answer 3 questions. And Antonia, please, if you can share the poll. So the first question is just for us to know actually in which sector are you working? Are you working with an NGO? Are you working with a governmental body? Are you working with the private sector or with academia or other? Please answer this question. If I'm not mistaken, you see only the results at the end. Otherwise, Antonia, please correct me. And then you have a second question, which is in the same poll below. Do you have experience working with weather, water, climate service? Is it daily business for you? Do you have some experience, or did you never work with that? And as a last question, just based on your experience, or maybe based on what you have heard until now by Omar, what do you think, what is the most relevant role of NGOs in weather, water, climate services? Is it regarding the local needs assessments? Is it managing the local observation stations? Is it about data management? Should NGO be involved in service development or in dissemination of the weather and climate information, or in advocacy? For the last question, you should have just single choice options. So which do you consider the most relevant? And also for the other questions, just like a single option. I see that we have like 81% of participants that voted. Maybe we just wait some more seconds and then we will show the results. Yeah, we have more than 90. Antonia, would you please share the results so we can briefly discuss them? Great. Okay, so we see that most of you are NGO practitioners, and we have also some governmental, very few private sector and other, and none from academia. This is something that we will catch up in the upcoming sessions. Then we see that we have 10% of experts, which are working in daily business with weather and climate services, and 58 with some experience. So we have quite a knowledgeable audience here with us. This is also great. I'm looking forward for the discussion. And the most relevant role of an NGO, rather a balanced picture with a small peak in dissemination of the service. But actually, you say that NGOs should and could be involved at all these different components. Wonderful. That's quite interesting. We will now stop sharing that and show you what we in the platform's learning journey have found out so far about this. So the roles of NGO along this value cycle, and I come back to this value cycle because for us it was really a key learning that we have to have this overview and to follow that model that is also a globally recognized model. Possible role of an NGO is definitely at the level of user requirements to support the need assessments, to support to find out what do the different users and especially the users that lack of access really need. And in that sense, it is often also a role of NGOs that they do advocacy for need-based services. At local level also, as we have seen, the management of local weather stations or the support to the management of local stations can be a very important role of the NGOs. And then we make a big jump to the service development where we have, for example, advocacy for services and also advocacy for access for all to these services. At the level of service dissemination, the support to the translation of these services, of this information and pure dissemination of this. Then definitely also ensure feedback loops. How do these services, how do this information reach to the users, and are these really the good information they need? Are the information accurate? So this is also an important role NGO can take. And then, of course, also support to very specific user services like early warning systems, like agrometeorological information system, etc. The big gap where you see no green box between data management, forecasting, projection, as Omar has mentioned, this is really an area where you need experts, where you need science, where you need specific IT infrastructure. So what we found out so far in our learning journey is that it's rather seldom, if not even existing, that NGOs are engaged in that or supporting that part of the value chain. Now, this is just a general overview with regard to the experience that we have as Swiss NGO DRR platform. I would like to invite you to the session that will take place at the beginning of this afternoon, Swiss time, but just to give you a glimpse. We have, in the experience we have between the members of the Swiss platform, we found out that most of them are involved in the coordination between the different stakeholders. We have seen there are plenty of stakeholders that have to work together, and somebody has to support or to do that coordination. Then we have the capacity building of the local actors and the local users, and this translation to the end users. I think it's quite obvious that this is close to typical NGO work as it is in general. Most of us are used to work in multi-stakeholder setups. We always coordinate between different actors, and it's definitely also part of our toolbox and of our daily work that we do stakeholder analysis, stakeholder coordination. So this is something that many NGOs are quite familiar with. Then, of course, many NGOs are also close to communities. We do capacity building of community-based groups, committees, user groups like water user groups, etc., but also with small and medium companies. So usually NGOs know the local actors and they know us. And so we are also quite well placed to do the translation or to support translation to the end user. This can really be like literally translation, meaning to do capacity building regarding the interpretation of weather information. What does that mean to a farmer? What does that mean to a fisherman or a fisherwoman? But also translation related to bringing the information to the end user via the right channel. Usually we know in the areas we work if people use more radios or if they have access to cell phones. So we can also support that the information is shared across a channel that reaches the end users. But then, of course, we have also challenges in all these roles. Are the NGOs accepted as convener and as coordinator of all these stakeholders? As we have seen, there are so many that are involved from national to international level. So as NGO, if you want to support and improve this coordination, you need to be known, you need to be accepted, you need to be recognized to play that role. This also depends a bit on how is your knowledge and understanding of weather, water, climate services in the organization. And I dare to say that in our platform learning journey, we identified some gaps regarding to that. This can be very specific, like, for example, if you are involved as NGO in distributing, maintaining locally rain gauges or local measurement systems, but you do not respect the standards of how this should be built up. And so you don't have accurate and useful data and nobody can use your data. So this can be a problem and a knowledge gap that should be filled up. And we hope that this learning journey, these 3 days, helps also to improve that knowledge. But then we have also heard Omar speaking about how accurate the forecasts are. And we know that forecasts are never 100% accurate. So this needs also some knowledge and understanding to explain to the end users why it is not 100%. So a minimum of knowledge is really key to be a reliable partner in that stakeholder environment. But then on the other hand, the weather information we rely on as NGO to play that role as broker, as information transmitter. If the weather information we get is not reliable, this can also influence the trust that then people have in us if we are acting as broker with not reliable data. So we have different challenges that we have to work on, and that we will also see in the different case studies of the platform members, how they have dealt with that. So far, our findings and recommendations in a nutshell are better exploit synergies with international stakeholders and initiatives. Very often there are also local and regional intermediaries present as rural extension services, agro-consulting services and others. As NGO, you have to work, you find out these potential synergies and work with them where they are. Then the integration of local knowledge and local observation methods. This is really important, and we will see some interesting examples on that later on. It is also important that with the investment that there is a good balance for software and hardware. Very often a lot or a bigger part of the budget is going into hardware like weather stations. But if you don't have the software, meaning the knowledge how to work with that, how to integrate the findings, how to deal with that information, the hardware as such is useless, and NGOs can have an important role, as we have seen. It is also important to choose wisely the user reach out model. There are different channels, from radios to SMS, from human-based information sharing in very remote places where you don't have access to any electronic or digitalized tool. So this is certainly something where NGOs can have a valuable added value. And last but not least, sustainability. That is a key issue. The pathway to sustainability or the business model chosen. This obviously also depends on the question if the weather and climate service is perceived and is built up as a public service or if it's a private service. So this depends a lot on how the stakeholders and how the model works in the area where you are. With that, I would like to close here these inputs, and I would be really happy to have your questions or maybe your contributions. Please add it to the chat or raise your hand later on. Regarding questions, maybe we cannot answer in this session all the questions, but remember that we will have all these different thematic sessions during the next 3 days, where you can really have then a deeper dive into the different aspects that you are most interested in. With this, I will close and I will stop sharing right now my screen, and happy to hear your questions or comments. Omar or Johanna, maybe while I was speaking, you could follow the chat. Do you see any questions or questions that maybe we can group? While our audience maybe is thinking about questions, I would like to take the floor and start with one, Omar, because you have shown us a graph where we have seen the accuracy of the different weather forecasts, and there was like different lines for the global hemisphere, for the northern hemisphere and for the southern hemisphere. Could you explain a little bit why we have this difference of accuracy according to where you are on the planet?
Yes, thanks for this question, Christina. Well observed. So this has to do with what I mentioned in the global observing system, that we actually have less information in the global south, particularly when it comes to the surface stations. You will have observed that actually this gap is on this graph is closing, because this has closed a lot since we have satellite information. So this is measuring the whole globe. And then if you look at the forecast as a large indicator, then the gap is no longer so strong. But if we look then at the focus at the really local and the surface level, the difference is still quite large. So that's where we have to engage more.
Thank you very much. Is there anybody who would like to ask a question? You can raise your hand or you can add it to the chat. Not so far. Probably, Omar, you explained so well that there are no questions left. We have the question if we can share the presentations. Yes, we can do that. We have foreseen that the session is recorded and will be uploaded on the website of the DRR platform. We can maybe share the link in the chat, but then we can also share the presentations, I would say. Thank you, Antonia, for putting the link in the chat. That is great. So we have the first question from the audience arriving. What is your experience on explaining uncertainties with local communities? Omar, maybe your experience. You have been working a long time in different countries. I know mainly your experience from Tajikistan, but maybe also others. How do you deal with that question if people say, you forecasted rain, but now it doesn't rain?
Mhm. Yeah, this is a very challenging one, one that keeps us busy, I would say. It's because in general, we are not very good with dealing with uncertain information as humans in general. So it's difficult to integrate this into the decision making, and many attempts then to illustrate this uncertainty lead that this information is wrongly interpreted, not the way it is thought for. So generally, the goal is to abstract the uncertainty and put it into different other kind of languages. As for instance, we use in the warnings where we have like a traffic light system, for instance, going from red to yellow, where yellow is actually could be a bit an uncertain state or just not very strong. So we mix then also this kind of information, or green, so that we are quite certain that nothing is going to happen. Really putting then numbers is difficult to the uncertainty, but also what seems to work is just in the use of language. So using common language expression for more uncertain or less certain, more certain levels of information also seems to work. But it's, let's say, a topic that we're still learning a lot. Hope that was informative enough. But there's no great answer, I'd say, to this question.
Thank you. Maybe one experience or one question based on my experience is that also now with climate change, the traditional weather patterns that people have observed, that farmers have been following, in many countries, they have changed a lot. Would you say that climate change also makes the accuracy of the forecasting more difficult? Do you climatologists need new methods, new modelings, new supercomputers, or how does climate change affect the forecasting? Or do you not see or is there no link at that level?
No, of course this impacts also the forecasts. But in general, I would rather say knowing about climate change improves the possibilities of forecasting. For instance, if you look at the long range forecasts of seasonal forecasts, since we know that's generally getting warmer, we are getting these better on average. Climate change is integrated in all these models, so it is actually the same models. They use different timescales, so the same physics are in there. So this does not necessarily reduce the quality of weather forecasts as sometimes you might think of. What of course is changing is our thresholds, our references. So if we speak of warnings and we relate the warning to a certain level of say precipitation amounts, we know that this level is changing and it's a challenge to adapt it. So when we communicate, for instance, high warning for flood, it is a challenge to keep adapting to this. At the same time, we have adaptation taking place, and so also the vulnerabilities are changing. So the whole impact assessment changes with it. But it does generally not lead to a decrease of forecast quality. That's not so.
Okay, thank you. Then we have one more question. What is your experience of working with combining scientific forecasting with traditional forecasting, nature science, etc.? Here we can make an advert for upcoming sessions, isn't it, Omar?
Yes, we will hear a bit more about these in some of the sessions. I have not spoken much about it, just mentioning Aristotle, which is, of course, a very long time ago. But I mentioned, of course, there are many practices worldwide to use local observations on how to combine it with global products. So the approach is very different, of course, and the experiences I have seen, which worked quite well, was to, when communicating to the beneficiaries that use these practices, to put the information alongside. So to have a discussion on how much agreement there is, how also this kind of observing systems that they use, how this language can be also be used, the same language, when bringing in more physical assessments of forecasts. So it's generally a great thematic to shape the dialogue and to have create a common understanding. In general, I would though still argue that we have a lot of information that is not that is possible, and it's important to take this therefore into account.
And just looking at the program, I can just add that we will have a glimpse of that in today's afternoon session, the platform experience, achievements and challenges from 5 projects around the world, where we will have examples from Central America, where they combine scientific forecasting with traditional forecasting. And if I'm not mistaken, on Friday morning in the climate projections and local climate scenarios session, we will also touch upon that. So looking forward to see you there again. Then we have one more question. Can you share examples or strategies of how to get national hydromet services on board to improve tailoring the data according to end users' need?
So yes, this has been something that the World Meteorological Organization, so the WMO, is trying to promote a lot in the last decades. Since the WMO is a member organization, so it consists of all national weather hydrological services and aims to improve their delivery, and aims also in particular to improve this mindset of tailoring their information to the end users, which in many cases is not yet the case. They understand themselves still more as data gatherers and selling this data or broker this data to others. So this is something that the WMO is promoting a lot, but this is an area also where NGOs, of course, can assist a lot and build the linkages to the communities and demonstrate how much more value can be created with this data. So entering this dialogue is sometimes difficult for NGOs, we understand. So the WMO, for instance, is a great door opener, and it's also, we will hear about this topic on tomorrow during the Global Framework session on how to partner with the WMO, because it has a lot of a strong incidence on the national agencies. And they are interested in strengthening this service delivery. So they are more and more interested in this partnership. And also, of course, other agencies from more developed countries are also great door openers to enter into dialogue. So this is a concept, as we call it, a peer-to-peer approach, where also national agencies are more willing to enter into dialogue when they speak to another weather center that can be part of a project.
Thank you. Great, and then we have one more question. In some local areas, local residents have not fully understood about the climate change or adaptation. Could you help explain more on how to engage and involve them more? Well, that's a large question. But I think many NGOs have experiences in that area. Maybe, Omar, you can share your answer, but I would also like to invite others, because we have about 80% of participants from different NGOs with different experiences, please raise your hand and comment. It's not only about asking questions to us, but also we would like to allow the discussion between you. But please, Omar, first.
Yeah, I would also think that many of you actually have better answers to this question than myself. But generally, I would say it's about communicating that what we think we know happens at the point where we live has changed. So where the memories where last time the water has risen are no longer valid. And so we need to take into account that we are entering into a new situation where we need to anticipate how this is going to change at the very local level. So whether your livelihood is safe or your house is safe. But perhaps someone has a better answer to this from the participants.
Link communities with champion communities. That's a very good answer. Yeah, there are definitely a lot of approaches. I can, for instance, quickly share that we in Helvetas, we are currently doing online trainings for all our staff all over the world about climate change and climate adaptation. So then we really have a global network of local experts that can then work with the communities on that topics, as it is also really in our perception that many people do not really know what happens to them due to climate change. They realize that there are so many things that change, that the weather is different, the natural hazards are different, etc. And there is quite a need for information as a first step and the risk analysis, and then try to support them in their adaptation and risk reduction efforts. Is there anybody who would like to share a concrete example? Take the floor, please. Don't be shy. I see so many known faces. Don't be so shy. Because time is running. If you want to share something, it's now. I cannot say now or never. It will be now or later. Okay. If there are not more questions coming, I dare to share again this here, because just to remind you that you will have plenty of other possibilities. This here was really like an introductory session. We wanted to give you an overview over all the different aspects and components of that issue of working with weather, water, climate services. It was really something that we learned as the working group in the DRR platform, that one has to understand that value cycle, and one has to understand what are the potential and what are the mandatory roles of some of these stakeholders. And some aspects of this complex environment, we will have deep dives from the next session onward, where we go into early warning systems and anticipatory action, and then through the whole program, you'll see it. And having the final concluding discussion on Friday afternoon. I would really like to invite you to participate as much as you can, because we as DRR platform are really convinced that weather, water, climate services is something that we have to strengthen in our DRR and adaptation work. And this is what we can offer to you so far. Also get to know different actors from the World Meteorological Organizations, from the private sector, from different NGOs, from different institutions. And we hope that you like that opportunity, that you take that opportunity, and oops, sorry, now it has gone, and that we can invite you to that learning journey and be with us the next 3 days. If there is no further comment or last question, I would like to close here. Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you very much to the presenters, Johanna and Omar. Thanks a lot to the translator, Ivan, and to our tech host, Antonia. And I hope to see you all soon again in one or the other session. Have a good day. See you.